very practical and very important event, introducing the 2018 Global Terrorism Index. I think everybody understands its value, and it enables us to assess the status and future steps of the situation or possible counter-terrorist measures, which will be based very much on this index. The Global Terrorism Index is produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we express our thanks and recognition to their work, because they have managed to codify now 170,000 terrorist incidents around the world. And it's good that our roundtable will convene internationally recognized experts to address topics like regional landscape and global terrorism trends, terrorist financing, prison radicalization, technology, strategic narrative campaigns, and the problem of foreign fighters coming and returning. I was also privileged to host 2 weeks ago another event addressing the roots of radicalization, especially radicalization used by Islam and other religions. And we came to the conclusion that we need to understand much better the true nature of big religions, to make a difference between distortions of these religions and the mainstream, and to try to educate people in Europe too. What are religions about? What are their cultural heritage? Because often we take a very biased attitude toward one, two, second or third religion just because of some terrorist acts. And clearly we need most of all dialogue between these different trends. But now my colleague Ramona Manescu has arrived. I would like to wish you a very fruitful debate today. Thanks for coming and sharing your knowledge. And I'll pass the floor to Ramona.
Thank you very much, Tune, for starting. We thought that we will be late a bit because there are still people coming up. So actually we wanted to wait for all the other participants to come. It was a huge queue in the entrance. Thank you very much for coming and warming up a bit the discussion. I don't know if you want the others to come, to wait for them, or we can continue search. What do you think? Yeah, they were on their way, but as you wish. Yeah, but we can. Yes, that would be great. We do have a very great panel, starting with you, of course, and going to Mrs. Meredith Stricker. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to have you here. It's also Mr. Fanstenkister. Yes. Sorry for my pronunciation. I'm not very good. And my good friend Niklas Novarki from Wilfried Martens Center. We cooperate very well together, and that's not for the first time working in an event. So thank you very much to all of you for coming and being part of this great debate. I will, because Tune already made the introduction. I will maybe give the floor to Serge to present the Global Terrorism Index for 2018, and then I will come back in the end with some ideas, some points. From my perspective as a member of the parliament, as also Tune did it. So you have the floor, and we are really eager to find out how this year, how is the global index showing the situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for, I would say, keeping up the tradition of having the Institute for Economics and Peace presenting the results and the findings and the trends of the Global Terrorism Index at the European Parliament. And it's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and with your staff, and to always notice this renewed confidence in the work and the research of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Actually, after the web launch yesterday evening, I guess this is the first live presentation worldwide. So you have this opportunity this morning. I will get into the details of the presentation. I guess most of you know the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we want to measure and quantify peace to create a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace. So we want to make sure that people of the world have access to our data, and the people of the world can be able to also know what the results of our research are. To do so, next to this data-driven research, we also want to communicate a lot, and we invest a lot in communication and promotion of the results of our research. We reach annually, globally, more than 5 billion people through media. We have about 800 million hits from digital media, and we support the work that is done in Sydney, our main office, and the research team in Sydney, with 5 other remote offices. So myself and the office in Brussels, one in The Hague, one in New York, together with one in Mexico, and the last one in Zimbabwe. So we work a lot, the Institute for Economics and Peace works a lot for international organizations that is using and also requesting data-driven analysis, and we have the chance to be ranked one of the 15 most impactful think tanks in the world, and this for several years now. The Global Terrorism Index of such is now in its 6th year. It ranks 163 countries, but this represents more than 99.5% of the world's population. So what we do is analyzing the relative impact of terrorism, and when I will talk about our methodology, you will understand better what we mean by this. Terrorism is only one of the 23 indicators that we use to compile our Global Peace Index that is produced every year in June, so it's only one of the indicators. We develop it ourselves, and we are guided by a panel of international experts globally. So this is the methodology. So we work together with the START Consortium at the University of Maryland, who has been compiling the Global Terrorism Database since 1970. So we have data that have been collected since 1970. We identify 4 different indicators, and we give it a certain weight to each of the indicators. So you will see here that the death is the indicator that is the most impactful, with a weight of 3, compared to incidents, number of incidents only 1, injuries 0.5, and property damage or damage to infrastructure that is ranging from 1 to 3. When we look at terrorism, we also see that this is a form of violence that is persistent over the years, because it installs a perception of vulnerability, a perception of fear that has an impact, a larger impact than just the act of violence itself. So this is why we try to measure the long-term impact, and this is where we look at also the relative impact of terrorism over the years, always trying to apply half of the impact over as the years pass on. We also use logarithmic bending scores, which is a typical statistics procedure. Why do we do so? Because we really want to look at the relative impact of terrorism. So when a country has an increase of, for example, 10 attacks or 10 deaths, it makes a difference if you go from 0 to 10, or if you go from 1,000 to 1,010. So to make sure that we have those differences and that we can look at the relative impact of terrorism, this is why we apply those logarithmic banding scores. Once we have done this, we are able to create the index, and then what we do, once we have the Global Terrorism Index, we also compare it with a lot of socioeconomic indicators to maybe look at phenomena that are evolving and trends that are evolving in global terrorism. So let's go to the results. So what do we see this year? We see that there is good news, and there is a bit of bad news also. So the good news is that in the past year, so when we talk about the Global Terrorism Index 2018, this is done with a compilation of all the data from 2017 and already an outlook to the data compiled in October 2018. So for 2017, we have seen a decline in deaths from terrorism by 27%. And if we extrapolate this to the last 3 years, so to the peak of terrorism in 2014, we see a global decline of 44%. So this is good news. But still, 94 countries have improved their scores, while 46 have deteriorated. And we see a massive fall of deaths in Europe by 75%. But please be aware, we see this is about the people who got killed by terrorism in Europe in 2017. But what we see also is that there were more attacks in 2017 than the year before. So we see an evolution of the fragmentation of the amount of attacks, most of them inspired by ISIL, not so, and all terms that I use are of course relative, not so impactful, not so successful than the ones we experienced in 2015 and 2017, but still impactful in installing this idea of this perception of fear and vulnerability. What we also see, although the phenomenon is still really small, but we see an evolution of the far-right terrorism, and we see that those figures are evolving positively, I would say positively, in the amount of attacks and the amount of people getting killed in those attacks over the past 4 to 5 years. What we can also say is that terrorism is still a global phenomenon, having more than almost 70 countries who suffered at least one death in 2017. Let's continue. So we see that 5 countries, and those are the usual suspects. So this is Nigeria, Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. You can just add maybe Somalia as the number 6 in the bottom 6 of the Global Terrorism Index. So we have those 5 countries recording more than 1,000 deaths, and 19 more recording more than 100 deaths. We have seen that Somalia and Egypt record the biggest deteriorations, although we need to relativate this because for both countries this is only due to one single attack. For Somalia this was in 2017, the attack, a car bomb next to a fuel truck on a market, killing 588 people, and for Egypt this was the attack on a mosque where more than 330 people were killed. So those 2 deteriorations are just linked to a single attack. What we see, and this is something I've been saying since I'm working for the Institute, and since I'm presenting the Global Terrorism Index and the other publications, is that in 99% of the cases of terrorism, those occur in a country that is engaged in a violent conflict or that is using political terror against its population. So when we are looking at the evolution of, I would say, terrorism in Europe or Western Europe and the United States or other parts of the world, where, I mean, I guess Belgium or Europe is not really engaged on its soil in a violent conflict, and I hope, but I'm pretty sure that we do not use state terror against our population, so we are in the last 1% of the impact of terrorism globally. What we see is a shift to other regions. I will speak later about the 3 hotspots that we have identified, but we clearly see that terrorism in East Asia is on the rise in figures and the amounts of attacks and the amounts of death. Positive, the death caused by ISIL were down by 52% in 2017, but still ISIL is the deadliest group in the world and not only in the Middle East. The biggest improvers, Iraq and Syria, with death down by 5,500 in Iraq and 1,000 in Syria. So let's look at the death from terrorism over the last 20 years, I would say. So we can see there on this slide that we have had different waves or different impacts of terrorism over the last 20 years. We can start with, unfortunately, a very successful attack on September 11, 2001, the war in Afghanistan, then the start of the war in Iraq, where we see another rise of the impact of terrorism. 2007, the US troop surge in Iraq in cooperation with the Sunni tribe leaders. We see that this had a positive effect. Until 2011, the start of the Arab Spring, the unrest in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and I would say several conflicts were flared up or started in this period of time. And then we see an exponential growth of terrorism, or the impact of terrorism over the next 3 years until the peak in 2014. That is then over, and then we see a decrease starting in 2014. So if you look at this slide, it's very difficult here to say that we get rid of terrorism. Of course, the figures that we are collecting in 2018 are showing a continued decrease of the impact, especially in Europe. So in Europe, until October 2018, only 8 people got killed by terrorism. So we see a very positive trend continuing. We are not able to say that we are going back to, let's say, normality. I don't know if there is normality in the realm of terrorism, but maybe we hope that effectively we will get back to normality and normal figures. But it can be another just wave until the next window of opportunity for terrorists to have another impact globally. So those are the figures. What do we see there is that in the top 5 or 6 countries, so this is about 80% of all the attacks in the world, only occurring in those 4 to 5 countries. And we can also concentrate on 4 to 5 major terrorist groups, being Al-Qaeda, ISIL, Boko Haram, the Al-Shabaab that is on the rise, and the Taliban, of course. I think what is a little bit disturbing in this slide is the fact that for the first, it's very positive for Iraq, because Iraq has been number 1 on this slide in the last 3 to 5 years, and I would say almost constantly over the last 10 to 12 years, I would say, since 2003 or the years after 2003. It's the first time that Afghanistan is number 1 on this slide, with 25% of the casualties falling in Afghanistan. So we see that something is happening down there, although we see another evolution in Afghanistan, and that's the fact that more and more military units and police units are becoming the targets of the Taliban. So we see a shift from really attacking civilian in Afghanistan to attacking more military and police forces in Afghanistan. So there again, I guess there is a new balance of military power in the country and a possible shift of the potential targets for the Taliban. When we look at the largest decreases, there again Iraq is there with more than 5,500, more than 1,000 in Syria, and then we see the other countries. When we see the decrease since 2014, when we see those figures, we can, and you spoke about this in your introduction remarks, we can ask ourselves the question, are we successful in counterterrorism? When you look at the figures, I would say yes, to some extent. So we see that the military action, military intervention in those countries in which the problems or terrorism really emerge, or the threat emerges, is very successful. We have been reducing the capabilities. When I say we, I said the West and the coalition that intervened there. So this coalition has been reducing, I would say, ISIL to almost nothing. We have estimations currently that ISIL is still controlling 1 to 5% of its territory and related resources. So we really went from 100% to less than 5 in a couple of years with the action of the international coalition. We see same results in northeastern Nigeria, where Nigerian military forces are putting pressure on Boko Haram, and they cannot get to the neighboring countries because of the multinational joint task force for the Lake Chad Basin that is active also in this region. So we see that this military action, there where the threat emerges, combined with enhanced security and intelligence efforts in Western Europe, are effective. Last year, we were showing slides about the success of CT in Europe, where we saw that more attacks had been foiled in the past year. So we see some results. The only maybe negative comment on this one is, or I would say it's even a positive comment, it's a positive advice, is to take care of the root causes of the conflicts and to take care of the root cause of radicalization, both in their own societies but also worldwide. So let's go on. The largest increase in death, I already spoke about this. So we see Somalia and Egypt, and I explained to you that this is just due to single attacks, or the fact that they are number 1 and 2 on the increase is due to single attacks. So those are the 4 deadliest groups. So as I said before, ISIL dropped by 52% last year, but still the most impactful. We saw a large drop by Boko Haram. We already had a decrease of 80% of the impact last year, and we see that this somehow continues, so it's stable this year. Same thing goes for the Taliban. What I see on this slide is Al-Shabaab that is still on the rise. The economic impact, I guess this is following one of the previous slides I showed you with the amount of attacks, the amount of death. So we have a very, very conservative calculation of an impact of 52 billion in 2017. So this is the cost of terrorism in 2017, but this is very, very conservative and focusing on the 4 indicators. So because it's impossible to track and it's impossible to collect the data, the investments in counter-terrorism are not part of this 52 billion. So let's look at some trends at the moment. So this is showing you the type of techniques and procedures that are most used by terrorist groups, or have been most used by terrorist groups in the 15 past years. So we see that bombing, explosions, and armed assault are still the number 1 tactics that are used by terrorist groups throughout the world. Let's look at the region, and I think this is really, briefing this in Europe or in Western Europe is really important. Because we can see that over a period of 15 years, terrorism has been hitting 3 regions in particular. So the Middle East and Northern Africa as the number 1 impacted region by terrorism, followed by South Asia. And I explained to you before that there is a rise now of terrorism in this region, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Those 3 regions accounted for 92% of all terrorist attacks and all terrorist casualties in the past 15 years. And there again, I guess just have a look at the figures for Europe, especially for Northern America. So those are figures for the past 15 years. When we look at the past 20 years, I think this is a very interesting slide. This is showing you that the evolution of the casualties, the evolution of the impact of terrorism is parallel, goes in parallel with the figures of the impact of armed conflict. So we see that over a period of 13, 14, 15 years, both terrorism and conflict death rose nearly 400% in those 13 years, and in parallel. So there is a correlation between violent conflict and terrorism. There again, this is showing you those figures per specific countries. And I said those are the bottom 6 of the global terrorism index. So except for Syria maybe and Pakistan, where we might have a little bit divergent data, we see that in the others there is some correlation between the amount of death caused by terrorism and the ones in armed conflict. This is by conflict type. So those are data that we received also that we managed coming from UCDP. So their definition of war is a conflict in which there is more than 1,000 deaths, minor armed conflict between 25 and 1,000 deaths, and on conflict basically where there is between 0 and 25 deaths. So we there again are trying to see you that to tell you that there is a clear correlation between armed conflict and terrorism. And as I said before, 94% of the deaths from terrorism occur in countries suffering from conflict, and then you can just add, I would say, another 5% for those suffering from political terror, and there you go with your 99%. This is just to show you the evolution of the death from terrorism in Western Europe and Northern America over a period of 20 years. So there again, we can follow the peak, and we see that for Western Europe after 14, 15, 16, we are on the decrease again. This is showing you the ISIL activity in Western Europe and Northern America in the last 4 years, so really the impact of the wave of terrorism as we have seen it in the last 4 years. We see that 54% of the attackers were basically lone wolves, lone actors inspired by ISIL, so there again, we can ask ourselves how lonely those wolves are. I guess the definition we should give to those people are lonely wolves following a larger pack, because there is an inspiration by ISIL. This is also to be linked with the information I gave to you before. So 75% decrease in death in the last year, but an increase in the amount of attacks over the past year. So by crushing Daesh, we also took away their capability to plan, execute, command and control large-scale attacks in the West. And therefore, the only resource that they still have are those homegrown terrorists or those lonely wolves that they can still inspire to commit terrorist attacks. For security services and for intelligence services, it is somehow much more easy to track a large-scale attack also, because you need to have a lot of communication, a lot of people are involved, so it's a little bit more easy for them to try to identify and track those large-scale attacks. It's almost impossible for the same intelligence security services to focus on the entire population, so to speak, because almost anybody can just like turn rogue one day and commit a very easy to prepare and to conduct terrorist attacks. And we have had enough examples of that in the past, especially in London, where just with a knife, with your car, or whatever you can find on the same morning, you can just try to commit a terrorist attack and create this permanent sentiment and perception of vulnerability and fear. Another thing that this slide is showing us is also that in many countries there is, of course, an impact of Islamism and this type of terrorism, but there are also other reasons or other causes for terrorism, or the ideologies that are at the basis of terrorism. This is the far-right extremism, terrorism, death and incidents in the last 10 years, and you can clearly see that, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, we see an increase in the amount of incidents, in the amount of deadly casualties in Western Europe and the United States. So, are we about the shifting landscape? So these are data corroborating what I said before about Daesh being crushed and really losing up to 95 to 99% of their capabilities. What we also see, and this has been said before also, is the rise of the impact of terrorism in Southeast Asia. You see that 3 different reasons for this, but of course Islamists and separatists being maybe the largest ones. And when you look at those the 3 hotspots that we have identified, the Maghreb and the Sahel as one hotspot, where we see a rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIL that is still present in this part of the world. We see Nigeria, where of course Boko Haram is under pressure but still active, but where we see a rise of the Fulani brothers that is committing more and more attacks in the middle belt of Nigeria. And then of course we see countries in Southeast Asia like Myanmar, and especially the Philippines, and especially Mindanao, which is one major island of the Philippines, where ISIL have been very active and where Islamism is taking over. To talk about the Philippines, we also see that communist rebel movements like the National People's Army are also the second cause for terrorism in those countries. So this is showing you an evolution of the death from terrorism in Myanmar and the Philippines. So you see been an increase in the past 5 to 8 years, especially in Philippines. You see this concentration in Mindanao. Same thing goes for Boko Haram and the Fulani extremists in Nigeria. So you see a decrease of the impact of Boko Haram, but then you see an increase and a spread also of the terrorist activities of the Fulani extremists in Nigeria. Terrorist recruitment, so we have figures about this also. We have seen an evolution in the type of people recruited by terrorist organizations. So where, for example, in 2001, with the attacks in New York, you would see that the commando there was really highly educated, people with medical degrees, with engineering degrees. We see a completely different approach to recruitment and radicalization today. We see that the terrorist groups, and specifically ISIL, are recruiting people with a criminal background, with a violent criminal background. This is somehow almost logic, because when you talk about radicalization, you basically talk about radicalization in violence. So for recruiters, it's easier to approach people who already discovered that they can achieve goals by using violence, and then just radicalize them for another 10, 20, 30% to 100% of the use of violence. There is another key factor for that. It's the narrative of redemption for those people. So they might have a very bad background in the countries in which they live at the moment. They can be alienated from those societies, but by engaging with ISIL and by combating with ISIL, there is this idea of redemption when you go from, I would say, zero to hero, and where your use of violence can be seen as something very positive in the new society in which you will evolve in the caliphate. Foreign fighters by country. So there again, and also those who return. So we see that the MENA region and Russia and Eurasia are still the main providers, but Europe is a good third in this ranking also. And we also see that only a minority of those who deployed to Syria and Iraq returned to the countries of origin. And I would say that the rest of those who deployed are either not in this world anymore or moved to other areas in which, with low governance, it's easier for ISIL to have an impact in other parts of the world. And I explained to you the three hotspots and the shift to Southeast Asia. This is just to show you how the different strategies for dealing with terrorist fighters returning by country. So we all know, for example, that in Europe there is not really an harmonized reception of those foreign terrorist fighters. Every country has another approach. And I would say per region of the world, you clearly see that there is another approach also to returning foreign terrorist fighters. And that was it. So I hope that I was able to show you the evolution, the trends, and also the key findings and results of the 2018 Global Terrorism Index. And I will be ready to answer your questions at the end of the other presentations. And there is a briefing available for everybody of you. For those who did not get one, at the end of the presentation, you can still come and see me, and then I will give you one, or one of my assistants will be able to provide it to you also. So thank you again for having me. Thank you again for organizing this, and I look forward to the debate afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge. It was a really, really insightful presentation, and as every year you bring very complex and exhaustive study on terrorism. It's okay. It's okay. No. And now I will pass the floor to Mrs. Meredith Stricker, Executive Director of Sufan Center. It will be also very interesting to hear from you back from Doha Forum, some new ideas and things that were discussed on the returning fighters in Doha. So, floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. I want to apologize in advance. I landed from New York a couple of hours ago, so I'm not at my most, I'm a teeny bit jet lagged, but I think we'll make it. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. Thank you. I was asked to present about the forum we had on returning foreign fighters in Doha, which happened to be the same week as the Doha Forum, but not the same thing. And to also talk a little bit about returning foreign fighters more broadly. So I will do those two things, and then happy to talk about terrorism trends or anything else at the end during Q&A. I am the executive director of the Sufund Center. We're a small think tank that operates out of New York City, and we look specifically at the nexus between security and human rights and humanitarian crises. So on October 30 and 31 of this year, with other partners in Doha, we were privileged to organize a conference, as I said, called the Forum on Returning Foreign Fighters. We did it then because it was exactly a year after we put out a report called Beyond the Caliphate, which was written by Richard Barrett, if some of you are familiar with him and his work. And in that report, which we were gratified to have, it's still in the press now, which makes us think we need to do a follow-up study because people are still quoting those numbers from a year ago. But we identified 5 types of returning foreign fighters. And this is strictly talking about fighters who left to join the so-called Islamic State. So I just want to reference that. The first are early returnees who left the caliphate before its decline, often after only a short stay, and tend to have less sympathy overall for IS ideology. The second are disillusioned returnees that had doubts about IS tactics and leadership, but not necessarily doubts about the objectives or the belief in a caliphate. The third are what we call thrill seeker returnees, who will have had their fill of adventure and heroics under IS, but they are likely to seek new theaters of jihad. The fourth are forced or captured returnees, who are likely to remain committed to IS ideology and more likely to recruit, form cells, and mount future attacks. And finally, what we call operational returnees, who are actually sent to third parties or back home by the Islamic State to carry out attacks abroad. And they're not exactly returnees, but we consider them about similar to that category of people who are back. We often get asked about women and children, and as you all know, I'm sure, every state has a different age that they're now utilizing for children. Even Western European countries are putting the threshold at about 10, which is fairly young, meaning that anyone older than 10 is considered an adult. And I'll get into this a little bit when I talk about the forum. But our general assessment is that the terms victim and perpetrator are very reductionist and are not actually helpful in thinking through what to do around the situation of women and children, specifically children. Given the numbers involved, and this is not going to surprise anyone here, the real problem for authorities is prioritizing targets and establishing what sort of approach to use. And we talk about that as obviously the incarceration versus rehabilitation, reintegration balance. So for that reason, we think allocating security resources is not always the answer. The focus has to be, and Serge, you mentioned this, on reducing the threat to manageable levels by working on the push and pull factors, especially increasing the capacity of the state to surveil citizens might actually increase terrorism in that you're alienating and marginalizing certain populations, drawing attention to them in a way that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of the things Richard Barrett says throughout this report, and anytime we talk about this, is we talk about reintegration, but most of these people were not integrated to begin with when we're talking about people who left. So we're really talking about integrating them in the first place. So surveilling them, probably not always the most conducive way to get them to be integrated. So I'm going to talk about what a whole of society approach to this looks like. But first I will get to the forum, because the forum was really interesting. The aim was to identify practical ways to implement United Nations security resolutions adopted both by the Security Council and the General Assembly, focused on the foreign fighter phenomenon. So 2178, 2396, which I assume people are familiar with, and to convene the foremost experts in the field to discuss related issues, including, as was already mentioned, terrorist financing, prison radicalization, strategic narrative campaigns, and other issues. Throughout the two-day conference, the concept of a whole-of-society approach to solutions, which engages governments, civil society organizations, and bi- and multilateral institutions, was emphasized. The forum convened officials and experts from over 60 countries. We had ambassadors, internationally recognized journalists, policy analysts, human rights experts, people from the film industry, counterterrorism practitioners, heads of intelligence agencies, academics, and researchers. So it was a truly multi-stakeholder event. And we thought that this was very important because people are often talking about these issues in their own verticals, and maybe like two verticals will cross, but not along this sort of swath of society. It was streamed live by Al Jazeera, which was a first for this, and it was simultaneously translated between English and Arabic. We thought it was really important to hold a conference like this with such a diverse participation in the region, because that doesn't typically happen. It happens here, it happens in New York, it happens in Geneva, but not often in the region. And we were told by a number of people, and we think this is significant in Qatar, that they had never heard such perspectives on terrorism before. And so, again, I don't want to belabor this point, but having the conversation move outside the usual spheres is really important, because then you have, we had a number of people from the Qatari government, but also from other governments, able to really hear from people all over the world. We had people from Mali to Malaysia, from China to Canada, and everywhere in between. We were honored to have the forum open with a keynote address provided by the Foreign Minister of Qatar, and then we had fireside chats with the Defense Minister of Qatar and of Greece. And all of this is available on our website. We videotaped everything, so if you are so inclined, we had Steve Clemens from The Atlantic and Charlie Savage from The New York Times, both of whom Charlie's won Pulitzer, to really ask tough questions to these defense ministers. So they threw some hard balls. So it was very interesting to hear their responses. And we had six panels and a special session co-hosted with CTED, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate of the UN, featuring members of their global research network from around the world. So there's much to share about the forum. I definitely don't have time to do that. But we did hear, and again, you can watch this, interesting perspectives from the UN, from the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the Anti-ISIL Coalition, the ICRC. We had current and former government officials from Qatar, the US, the UK, and the European Union. And as I already mentioned, moderators were there from CNN, New York Times, Atlantic, Bloomberg, and the New Yorker. So I think also having some journalists moderate was interesting, and that they could really get some interesting questions. So I just want to point to 5 major trends and sort of recommendations that were brought out in the course of those 2 days. The first is that terrorism and the foreign fighter phenomenon in particular, which the world saw on an unprecedented scale with the rise of the so-called caliphate, are extremely complex issues requiring a multi-stakeholder solution. That means interventions at the individual, family, community, city, and nation-state level, all of the above. Governments must do their part, researchers have to do their part, NGOs do their part, and multilateral bodies theirs. In the case of multilateral bodies, because we've talked to the UN about this a number of times as well, I think the main argument made was we have to codify international norms that work to beat terrorist groups while respecting the balance between security and human rights. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Conflict, Fionnuala Ní Oileán, whose name I always butcher, she was there and spoke about this at length. The concerns that her office has around not having a human rights framework that matches up with either of the 2 main UN Security Council resolutions that deal with terrorism. And encouraging compliance by leading by example by individual member states is really important. The second theme or trend is the cyclical nature of terrorism. And I urge you all to try to find this documentary. I'm sure we could work out how to get it to you if you're interested, but it's called ISIS Tomorrow, The Lost Souls of Mosul. And it was one of the things we did. We screened that by Francesca Minocci, and she spent about 2 years in Mosul. And it's really a stunning display of watching the cycle of terrorism happen. So we're talking about the children who are left, the families of ISIS fighters who are still in Iraq. And, you know, I can just say quickly, because I was mentioning this at the UN on Tuesday, but we were able to screen 10 minutes of it. I wish I could have done that here as well. But you see that even when these children and women get out of these so-called rehabilitation centers, which are really just prisons, their homes are then spray painted after with Daesh, you know, in Arabic. So everybody knows who they are and, you know, point at them and won't talk with them. And so the point being that when your identity is put on you by an outside person, often you double down on that identity. Similarly, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, people ask us, do you think women and children are victims or perpetrators? The women question is more complicated for obvious reasons. Children don't have developed brains and don't have agency in the same way, so it's much more complicated. But even if you're talking about a woman who didn't necessarily believe in the violent ideology of the Islamic State, she very well may have loved the person who did, her husband, her son, her father, her brother. And so to say that she's against ISIS or for ISIS is actually a very complicated thing to say. And by just reducing it to this victim-perpetrator binary, we're missing a lot of how to deal with this problem going forward. So the stigmatization of these people, of these thousands of people left in Iraq, should be of deep concern to the international community. And we, you know, one of the recommendations was, in order to stem the cycle of violence and eliminate the push and pull factors of radicalization, the fragmenting of society, both through stigmatization and sectarianism, must stop. The third major point is, and again, this isn't rocket science, but it's important that sort of everybody agreed on this, I think. Narratives resonate when people feel like their own experience bears them out. So in order for extremist narratives to not hold sway, a focus on good governance, equality, and equity, along with both top-down and bottom-up approaches, to creating integration and resulting societal cohesion are necessary. To say we need to play the long game here, and that's hard, especially in a country like my own, where the election cycle keeps us, you know, running constantly, and, you know, tough on crime sells and tough on terrorism sells. But this is a long-term problem that is going to require a long-term solution. The fourth point is the foreign terrorist fighter threat and the terrorist threat more broadly need to be right-sized. Media coverage of terrorist events, both traditional and social media, is massive and often disproportionate to the actual threat, if the GTI tells us anything, right? It also gives terrorist groups the oxygen for which they are looking. My boss, Ali Soufan, who's well known in these circles, will say there's no such thing anymore as an unsuccessful terrorist attack. Because even if it's thwarted, it gets so much attention that it's exactly what they want. So an informed media leads to an informed public. And that is the responsibility of governments, researchers, and civil society, so that media isn't operating in the dark without the right facts and figures, because they are already operating in the 24-hour news cycle now. They have to fill that space. So it's something for all of us, I think, to think about. Last but not least, good policy is informed by good data. During the first panel of our forum, we had the global landscape panel, and that included Gilles de Kerkhove and Fionnuala, who I mentioned before, and Peter Bergen, who runs the New America, or is with New America and CNN, and somebody named Nick Rasmussen, who is the head of the National Counterterrorism Center. And if I, other than Fionnuala, who focused a lot on human rights, if I could sum up sort of the thrust, and that was moderated by Richard Barrett, the thrust of that panel was there's so much we don't know. We don't know how many people have left. We don't know how many people have actually died. We don't know for sure how many people have returned. And we don't know of those who have returned who are a real threat. So there's a lot we don't know, and it's really difficult to ask government to create effective policies when there's so much that they just don't know. So researchers are an essential component for providing governments and multilateral bodies with the data and the numbers they need to enact smart, effective policies. And I'll just end with a couple of points about FTFs particularly that came out from this conference, because that's sort of a general terrorism and FTF overview. The first is that while we're dealing with and must continue to deal with the current phase of the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon, we must also think forward, because there will be another phase, another cause, and another issue that attracts people to join it. We're already seeing, of course, far-right groups, neo-Nazi, white supremacist groups. Ukraine is certainly an area that we're deeply concerned about. The Kurdish issue in question is something that we're watching, and other Islamic jihadi groups. We know this, but it's important to state foreign fighters do not recognize borders. This is a global, call to action. And so their presence in conflict zones can exacerbate local struggles. And this is something Al-Qaeda does brilliantly, is play on or prey on the local struggles of an area, like in Yemen or in Kashmir with AQIS, or in Yemen AQAP, in Kashmir AQIS, and is able to recruit people because of already pre-existing local issues. There's a global pool of sympathetic individuals who can be mobilized quickly, cheaply, and easily to join groups and their conflicts overseas. We don't belabor the social media point so much. I think social media is crucially important, but also an easy scapegoat, because it seems like something that governments can regulate and then fix really easily. And we say and it's not only us saying this, but the messages end up on Twitter. They don't start on Twitter. That's not how it starts. That's just sort of where it feeds into. So you do have to work on push-pull, but social media makes it so easy to recruit people in a way that we have never seen before. And then the last point, since I happen to be in Europe, we had one researcher who focuses on the Balkans, and he pointed out you have 4 times the number of returnees in the Balkans as you do in Western Europe. But the Balkans doesn't have nearly the same resources to deal with that issue as Western Europe does. So the way he put it was, Europe has a Western Balkans problem. I mean, because there are no borders like there used to be anymore, what you see is it's no one state's problem anymore, no one region's problem anymore. We just, we're beyond that phase now. So the reason that we were so thrilled to have actually over 60 nations represented was to, reflect the global nature of this problem. So I think I'll stop there, but if there's any questions later, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Meredith. It was really, really interesting, and I'm sure there will be questions in the end. I will now go to Mr. Philip van Stekenste, and I'm really happy to have here somebody talking about the victims from the victims' perspective. It's something very new to the European Parliament, to be honest. We always discuss the human rights. We always discuss the perspective of those perpetrators of the terrorists, the reasons of why they become terrorists. But we always forget, and we never have somebody to talk about. We don't have the associations and organizations to talk about the victims. And sometimes it becomes frustrating, because the victims are a very important part in all the pictures. And if we forget, then we might take wrong decisions in the end. And this will be shown in the future. So I'm looking forward to hear your perspective.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, you summarized everything I wanted to say. So, so I will first start with introducing myself. My name is Philip van Stekenste, but please just say Philip, because I know I've got a very complicated name. I lost my sister on the attacks in Belgium on the 22nd of March 2016, and that's where it all started for me, in fact, because what happened? For months and months, we were like abandoned in total silence. So what we decided to try to understand what was going on, we went to France to meet victims in France and victims from Paris from the 13 November 2015 attacks. And there we discovered that we finally had a big family because people could easily understand us and we could understand them even without talking. There was a kind of, suddenly we are respected. People know what and feel what we are going through. So we decided to come together also between victims from Belgium to start with. And of course it's very complicated because we all know the laws about privacy, etc. So we couldn't get in touch with other victims. And that's why we went via the press in Belgium and we did a call to all the victims saying, hey, we're going to sit together, come together and discuss our issues. And very fast, it was pretty successful. Within a couple of days, we were more than 50 victims coming together. Today, we are more than 250, of about 250 victims, victims from the Belgium attacks, but also Belgian victims from the foreign attacks. And there are quite a lot, regretfully. So this is how it all started. In fact, what is a victim of terrorism? A victim of terrorism is an ordinary citizen like you and me who for no reason at all suddenly becomes victim of a cause he's even not be able to manage, or has no influence on this one, and all his life gets destroyed from one moment to the other one. Bingo. Not only him, but his whole surrounding too. And it's a very complex situation because, of course, you can't compare the pain, you can't compare the sadness, you can't compare all these issues one with another, not with another victim of terrorism, but neither with a victim of crime or car accident or illness. The pains are there. But there is one particularity with the victims of terrorism, and that is that the victim or the person has been used as a tool to attack our democracy, our society, the state. So you are used really like a hammer or whatever to attack something that is completely disconnected from you. This implicates that you suddenly lose everything what you've learned in your life. All these values are suddenly shattered because you don't understand what's going on. Why me? What have I done wrong? I'm a normal citizen, I pay my taxes, I try to build up my life. All the values we have taught or educated ourselves or have been educated suddenly are gone because of a reason we don't understand. Terrorism is there to attack our values, the state, and what's happening with a victim of terrorism, that is that, okay, you have to start life again from zero, you have to rebuild yourselves, but if you're not understood, you feel like isolated from society. And that's the key point. The victims must be again reintegrated into society. It's very complex because you have to learn again, walking, talking, everything must be learned again, taught again, like to a small child. You can't concentrate anymore because of a trauma. So if you have to concentrate for 10 minutes, it tasks huge efforts. Many victims need a lot of sleep. It's very complicated, and many times I approach victims with very complex words because suddenly you learn words from the legislation, what are your rights, how can we help you, and you get a whole list of a complex situation. They can't take this one. So one of the key points is that we have to reintegrate all the victims without any discrimination. We have to give them the time to rebuild themselves, because society doesn't allow this. If you are working in a company or you're a freelancer, you can't take even not 1 month the time to rebuild yourself, because you have obligations. You have to keep paying your taxes. Everything is still there. So the society must understand that we need to give the time for the victims to rebuild. And of course, it's very complex, because I might be okay now, and tomorrow or this evening I might be bad, but the other victim might be very bad now and good tomorrow. Or some victims need months to get over this issue, even psychology. Other persons just weeks. Or even worse, some people are right now, 1 month later, 1 year later, but 5 years later, bingo, post-traumatic trauma, even 30 years later. So it's very complex, but all the victims, without discrimination, must have the right to be able to rebuild themselves, and then they must be able to reintegrate society. Because what do they need, a victim? They just want to get back into a normal life, as normal as possible, and as much as possible like before. But there again, many people say, come on, this attack happened 1, 2, 3 years ago, you should get over it. Turn the page. No, this is a total wrong approach. You can't turn the page. This is a page that has been added into your book of your life. What you have to do is learn living with it. So you have to digest all this trauma, everything that happened, you have to digest it. And only if you digested it, you can start again to live. Even if at any moments in life you can have sadness, that's okay, but that's a new life. So people must realize I have to start a new life. So the impact of terrorism is enormous. But we can't accentuate it too much, because if we accentuate it too much, we also show the weaknesses of our society and the strength of terrorism. The impact is enormous because a victim is affected, but the victim is a person who is recognized by the state as a victim. But then you have children, grandchildren, parents, grandparents, friends, schools from the friends. It goes really like when you put a drop of the water into a liquid and it makes a wave. It's really like this one. Because, for example, friends, people expect you to become like before, but you changed. So the friends you had for many years, your best friends, or even couples, if one person is a victim and the other partner is not a victim, it creates huge problems because everyone expects a weight that you become again like before. You can't. So it affects your friends, it affects everyone. So the impact is enormous, much more than just figures, even though the figures are extremely important. For sure. I will come back to this one. There have been done many researches on victims of terrorism, and I think over the last years, they start to become the recognition. But one of the key countries, and I'm talking about Europe now, one of the key countries is Spain. Spain has an extremely long history of terrorism, and they have done a law for the victims of terrorism. And just in the introduction of this law, it's just a couple of pages, you can see the whole philosophy of how we have to integrate, how we have to treat victims is perfect. They understood it. A second country who is doing a very good job is now France. So we've got Spain and France. they understand what is the impact and how to fight this, how to fight and minimize the impact of terrorism on a society. What Spain says is in fact resumed in 4 words. It's dignity, commemoration, truth and justice. Dignity, why? Because the victims feel lost, there is also stigmatization. The dignity is the last thing they still have. Extremely important. Respect the victims, treat them with dignity. Commemoration is of course important because it should not be forgotten. Truth and justice. We've seen through many big problems that people, victims, can only start to rebuild themselves once justice has been done. Now, justice is not revenge, it's justice. Truth and justice, to give you an example of what we are doing, a couple of weeks ago I also went to Iraq and to Syria for the victims of terrorism, together with an MP from Belgium and 2 war correspondents. Because we need to understand, who is ISIS? I will call it Daesh. Who is Daesh? We don't know. We became subject, our life has been destroyed for some geopolitical reasons. We are not aware of what's going on. So we need to find what is this truth and look already to the justice. And realize it is an extremely complicated situation. Because of course we are also interested in the FTFs. And then you also see the families, the wives, the children, what's going on. I agree very much with what you say and really appreciate it, because the situation is very, very complex regarding FTFs. We went to Iraq, but the Kurdish side, KRG. We went to Syria, also the Kurdish side. This is for reasons that are beyond me. But we're close to Mosul. We visited camps of refugees. It's quite heartbreaking to see this. Then in Syria, we visited camps of detainees from the women and the children from Daesh fighters. It's very complex because, as I said, the dignity is important for victims, but we have probably had such suffering that the last thing we want again is suffering. We try to look at the good sides of life, very important. Have again this hope, life is not evil, life is good. When we went there, we had big talkings about what do we do with the women, what do we do with the children from FTFers. It's a big topic. They regularly come to us to ask questions. How can you answer if you don't know, in fact, what's going on? When we were there in Syria, for example, we saw that we met a Belgian woman who was the wife of a fighter who went to Syria. And when she talked, she had a small child, we realized that, okay, somewhere she wants to take a distance from this Daesh cause, although she still believes in the caliphate. So it's one of your points also. And stigmatization is an issue, but not from the people, non-Daesh, but from the Daesh people. Because she tries within the camp to keep away her child from the other children, but she's now there for 1 year. She learned French to her child, not Arabic, but after 1 year, that child, of course, speaks Arabic and starts to hear everything that's going on. So the mother tries to keep the child away to protect it. It's not working. But also from her side, because she gave an interview, she was directly stigmatized at the risk of her life within the camps. She was afraid that they will burn her tent in the middle of the night with her child in it. So she can't distantiate herself from Daesh as she would like to. But again, still said, she still believed somewhere in the caliphate. How to deal the women and the children? Women is an issue because some women were actively fighting with Daesh. That's clear. And other women were not actively fighting with Daesh and were trapped. So each case is a little bit different, and you have to watch case by case, what is very complicated. Then the children also. What do you do with the children? Is it somewhere human that you take away a child from the mother? It's very complicated. The mother says, please take my child away. But is it the best solution? Because she has not all the hope. Probably it is a solution. There is no good solution, but it is a solution which you have to look at. And you hope that somewhere in the future they can reunite. But there again, the situation is complex because many women have children from different Daesh fighters, and so different nationalities. So it can be that a woman from Chechnya has a child who is Belgium, another one who's French. What do you do? Very complicated. I just want to point this out that in reality, on the field, it is very complex. So I told you a bit what are the needs of these victims, of the victims of terrorism. I come back to the victims of terrorism. It's again reintegration, trying to reintegrate the people and give them the allowance to rebuild themselves. As I said, Spain and France are doing a good job. Here in Belgium, we had nothing. It's difficult because the frustration, the feeling of injustice is just increasing. So we try to have a buffer zone in there. Things are slowly progressing, but we are almost 3 years later than the 22nd of March attacks. So in 3 years, it's 3 years lost for many people, and not only 3 years because physically it affects them so much. Maybe they lost 6 or 7 or 8 years of their life. This is also reality. Not all of them, but many. For the moment, the law is changing. People listen here in Belgium. So, okay, there was one who passed 2 days ago. So it is progressing, but far too slow because everything is so complex. And then there is still a key issue, for example, insurances. In Belgium, the victims are still subject to insurances. So we are, the insurances will see what was the impact on your health. And of course, once you talk about insurances, there is a conflict of interest because these are private companies. So the system is not working properly. In France, they have a fond guarantee, which is a common fund for the victims of terrorism. This system is the right system because then there is no conflict of interest. And we talked about this issue at the European Parliament with the Commission from Nathalie Griesbeck. It's clear, you don't involve insurances with the victims of terrorism. So on that aspect, there is still a lot of work to do here in Belgium, but also in Europe. Because what is needed? This kind of fond guarantee, a fund, a common fund, but also coordination. Why? Coordination, of course, to fight terrorism, but also to support the victims. If an attack happens in, let's say Madrid, for example, it's a city where many people, foreigners, are visiting. So an attack happens, many victims go back to their country of origin, and then may start, if they are not wanted, then they may start the trauma that gets into place. So the recognition must be there from that country or that member state, and we must be able to help this person in that trauma. So this coordination between Europe member states is extremely important on the recognition, but also on assuring that they have the right help, the right support. Okay? Extremely important. We, from our side, because we realized, okay, the attacks in Paris were also, in fact, coordinated out from Belgium. We say, well, they can cross the borders without any problems. So we, as just between the victims, we start to coordinate already between us. I became an administrator from the French Association of Victims of Terrorism. France came to us They have also already more expertise. We sent our victims here from Belgium, where it can, to France for the psychological support, because we don't have this expertise. Next to it, we also work with the United States. We've sent someone to choose their children and start cooperating with them. So between us, we start to come together. And also, we look at the future. If something happens in Spain, and we know, or we get to hear that some Belgian citizen is affected, we know straight away who to contact from the Association of Victims, and they know their way within Spain of how to give the right support to this person. So these are things we all start to do, but we are doing this really from a civic perspective. We are totally independent. We just do this to survive. And because we know what we have been through, we wish no one to have to go through the same thing. So we try to put things into place, but on a civic point of view. I would like maybe to conclude we were at the commemoration in France, national commemoration of the victims of terrorism in last September, and President Macron was there. And there was a sentence which I really liked because it resumes quite a lot. He said, "We have to help the victims of terrorism because this is fighting terrorism." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. It was really emotional and insightful as well, giving us all these examples and sharing with us what the association is doing and which are the struggles of the victims, actually, of the terrorism. I will now pass the floor to Niklas Novaki, my colleague from Wilfried Martens Center. He's a researcher, and he's very knowledgeable in the field of European policies, and especially in this field. So, Niklas, we are looking forward to hear from you as well.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and although it's very difficult to follow, like the three excellent speeches that were already given, I'll try to do my best, and also be as brief as I can. First of all, I want to say that it's encouraging to see from this Global Terrorism Index 2018 that there's been a big year-on-year improvement, and that the total deaths from terrorism in Europe have fallen by 27%. That's very positive news. And also that in Western Europe specifically, I mean, deaths have fallen by 52%. And then in this year, we've seen fewer than 10 deaths recorded in this region. But also on the negative side, as Serge said, I mean, the number of incidents has increased, so there is still plenty of work to do, unfortunately. And this terrorism is a challenge and a phenomenon that is definitely a major concern for all Europeans. We saw, for example, from a Eurobarometer survey last year that as many as 95% Europeans see terrorism as an important challenge, so practically all of them. And what's important is that they specifically see it as a challenge at the EU level and instead of the national level or the personal level. So this is an issue, a challenge that in which the European Union faces tremendous pressure from its citizens to act and deal with the problem. What I want to kind of briefly kind of talk about and discuss is how Europeans' concerns about terrorism could potentially be eased and dealt with by improving the effectiveness of two mutual assistance clauses that the European Union has in its treaties at the moment. And these are the Article 42.7 of the Treaty on the European Union, and then Article 222 of the Treaty on the Functioning European Union, also known as the Solidarity Clause. First things first, Article 42.7, it's something that was introduced by the 2009 Lisbon Treaty. It was developed during the 2002-2003 Convention on the Future of Europe. It basically states that if a member state is the victim of armed aggression in its territory, then other member states shall have towards it an obligation to assist it with all the means available to them if necessary. And this language in this clause is actually like rather strong, and it's rather effective. And even if you compare it to, for example, NATO's very famous Article 5, it's rather similar. But then it's slightly watered down by another sentence which says that like this assistance commitment shall not kind of affect the special character of certain EU member states' special security and defense policies. Basically, that means that if you're a neutral or a non-aligned country such as Finland, where I come from, then you're not expected to provide that sort of assistance that would compromise your non-alignment or neutrality. The second article is the solidarity clause, and this was also introduced by the 2009 Lisbon Treaty and also developed during the Convention on the Future of Europe, and also featured in the failed constitutional treaty that collapsed in 2005. And what's important about the solidarity clause is that it was designed purposely to deal to express solidarity to a member state that experiences a terrorist attack or a natural or a man-made disaster, irrespective of whether that event originates from within or outside that member state in question. And more specifically, I mean, the clause says that that the EU shall mobilize all the instruments at its disposal, including military resources made available to the member states, to prevent terrorist threats, protect democratic institutions and the civilian population, and assist a member state in its territory at the request of its political authorities. So there is already this tool in the treaties that could be used to respond more effectively, deal more effectively with mass casualty terrorist incidents when and if they occur. And one of these clauses have already been used, and that took place after the 2015 Paris attacks, when France, then President François Hollande, invoked the Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union. And why France did this was that it asked EU member states to show solidarity and assisted in three different ways. I mean, the first was that France wanted contributions from its EU partners to various French national operations, EU operations, and various international crisis management operations around the world, so that it could itself then pull out its own forces and focus more on the fight against ISIS. And importantly, France did not ask for assistance to deal with the domestic terrorist situation, because that terrorist situation was already being taken care of by Operation Sentinelle, which is still operating in France. But then the important question is that why France chose this article and not the solidarity clause, which is the purposely designed instrument for fighting terrorism. And I think there's like three important reasons. I mean, the first is that at the moment the solidarity clause is procedurally rather heavy, and it gives an implementation role for EU institutions. There were guidelines, implementation guidelines that were adopted for it in 2014 that describe everything from how it should be invoked to how it should be phased out when the assistance is no longer needed. 42.7, on the other hand, is procedurally extremely light. It gives no specific role to EU institutions. It's purely intergovernmental, and the countries using it can implement it however they wish. The second reason is that paradoxically, like the solidarity clause would also send a message that the country invoking it is no longer able to handle its own domestic security situation, which is problematic. And the reason for this is that the implementation guidelines explicitly say that it can be invoked if a member state suffers a terrorist attack if it considers that the crisis clearly overwhelms the response capabilities available to it. Now, like if you're a country like France or Belgium in 2016 that suffered a mass casualty terrorist attack, and you're expected to respond to this attack and then also kind of maintain the confidence of your own people about your ability to handle the domestic security situation, admitting that your own response capabilities are involved, like, sends politically the wrong message. And I think this is something that needs to be changed. And then the third reason was that the solidarity clause is designed more for a solidarity provision internally within the EU, whereas this other clause, 42.7, can also be used to provide solidarity externally, like if needed. And this indeed was what France needed in this specific case. So 42.7 has been used once. Solidarity clause has never been used yet. Not after the French attacks, not after the March 2016 attacks here in Brussels, and not even after to respond to the massive wildfires in Portugal, Greece, and Sweden this year. Like even though it could have also been used in that context. So what could be done? I mean, just very briefly, I think the 2014 implementation guidelines for the solidarity clause should clearly be reviewed and updated to ease solidarity provision internally within the EU, like especially following a terrorist attack. And I think the language in Article 4 of these guidelines, which I already mentioned, which would send the message that a member state asking for solidarity is then admitting that its own response capabilities are overwhelmed, needs to be rewritten and made politically more neutral. And then I think, thirdly, we should start organizing annual anti-terrorism response exercises, so that we could practice and kind of respond and develop our own procedures for responding to mass casualty terrorism incidents. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for your contribution also. I think it's maybe something else. I mean, we spoke about the threat that is evolving. Another figure for the terrorism index. Last year in 2017, we discovered 44 new terrorist groups. So those are groups that might have existed before, but would never committed an attack or created casualty. So we see effectively a spread of this phenomenon also. Foreign terrorist fighters and homegrown terrorist fighters, to tackle this issue, and you have made a point about this, and especially when you made a point about the Balkan and the Western Balkan. I think it's pretty clear that Europe is having a problem in the Western Balkan, and the Institute is trying to also have an impact there with positive peace projects. Is the amount of resources and the amount of work that is needed to tackle these issues of FTF and HTFs, and also the missing policies, and also the incredible coordinating effort that will need to be done on an international basis or regional international basis to take care of these issues. I think what we need to understand, and I was really pleased that Philip accepted to be with us today, to really give, as you said, the view of the victims. I think what we need to understand is that the victims needs to be seen as the spark that is igniting the process, really the catalyzer that is then igniting a process. And the process itself is a discussion between a terrorist group and a state or government of this state. And once, like in the second after the attack, the victims are not part of the debate anymore, are not part of the concept anymore. Because there again, it's just the terrorist groups with the grievances and the goals they want to achieve, and the state that is the target, and of course the media that is organizing the debate between those two actors. So the second after the attack, the victims start to be forgotten. And I think it was really nice to have you here, and I think it's important to have also this part of the debate in such an organization conference like today. I think thank you very much also, Niklas, for your intervention on what the EU is doing in the institutional approach to tackling terrorism. I think it was really important to see that an organization such as the EU has a role to play, or has the role to play, to coordinate counterterrorism activities within Europe and to create more resilience within Europe. And I think what we all understood in my presentation and the four interventions afterwards is these blurred lines between internal and external security, where when you want to fight terrorism, you need to fight it at home, but also elsewhere. So thank you very much for your contribution. I think we will have some time for your questions now. So I will be really happy to take your questions. And before handing over to you, if with your permission, I would like to give the floor for maybe 5 minutes to somebody that is in the room and also prepared. So some intervention for today about, it's an NGO that is doing PTSD for victims also. So I will give him the floor about 5 minutes before hand it over to you for your final remarks. So please ask your questions. We are keen to answer them. And please use the microphones and identify yourself. Were we that clear? I mean, there is no reception, no coffee, so you don't have to dodge the questions to get straight to the coffee. Yes.
So you talked about this difficulty of reintegrating or integrating people into society after this conflict, which is obviously linked to a lot of trauma and a lot of obvious negativity and crime. Recently, I overheard some parallels being drawn between rehabilitation after Second World War with former Nazis and now, which is kind of following the same extreme thought and methodology and hate group and targeting of certain people in society within the field of operation, physical field of operation, and also an ideological one. Obviously, there were issues with reintegrating former Nazis in current societies, and there is still an impact on certain members. How do you draw the parallel between that, or have you already considered drawing a parallel between those two situations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really interesting question. Not specifically that. We've talked more about the parallels with those who went to fight the Soviet jihad in Afghanistan, for example, and then you had a lot of Western Balkans fighters, for example. But I think what's relevant about that and your example is that this is, I was at a UN meeting where someone was talking about lessons learned around child soldiers from, say, the LRA or FARC. And I said, absolutely, but with all due respect, there's no way you can compare the stigma or the issue that this is a global war on terror, that we're now trying to integrate or reintegrate people who went to fight. There's no corner of the earth where people don't have an opinion on those fighters. Whereas if you took child soldiers from the LRA or from the FARC and moved them somewhere else, presumably they could reintegrate a lot more easily. So your example about Nazis makes a lot of sense to me because they were world-renowned, right? There's nowhere they could go where the moniker Nazi wouldn't follow them and wouldn't have an impact. In fact, someone compared it the other day, and I'm trying to remember where I was now, to former, somebody who's a sex offender, a sexual predator who then gets, everybody knows their situation once they come back out into society. So we have a serious problem because you have to balance the need to actually punish people who committed crimes, the fact that there's not a lot of evidence to support the prosecution and then the incarceration of those people is a problem in and of itself. But I think that the only thing that I can say is that this is going to require local solutions to what is a global problem. So how Belgium reintegrates people or integrates them in the first place, how Iraq is going to do that for the issues that you raised, Philip, and the issues that I raised because of Francesca's documentary, how that happens in the United States, that takes a much more, we take a totally different approach, sort of melting pot approach at the start. It's going to look different everywhere. That is problematic when you have international norms that you're trying to also institute. So we have problem upon problem upon problem, or I should say challenge upon challenge upon challenge. But I think that trying to learn lessons, as you described, from examples that actually do parallel is really important and something that the research community could potentially take up, and what we're looking into it from the Soviet jihad perspective.
More questions? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Giacomo Martello. I'm just wondering, looking at Afghanistan now being #1 in terrorist attacks, does it have an impact with ISIS fighters going from Iraq to Afghanistan? And if yes, are they fighting with the Taliban or against them? And also regarding the fund, would it be possible or imaginable to have a fund at the European level to actually have a more impact and impact on all victims all over Europe and not just in third countries? Thank you.
Go first.
Right. Definitely we have to organize and coordinate between everything what regards the victims, to be able to reintegrate them. There is some work going on right now. We are cooperating with a project that has been requested by the President of the European Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker. He has appointed a person who by coincidence is also an ex-Minister of Interior from Belgium, Madame Milquet. And we are working now on one issue that regards the compensation. So this is one issue because it is clear that following the studies they've done in the United States regarding PTSD, and probably you can talk more about this one, the cost, if you don't treat the PTSD as soon as possible from the beginning, it's something that drags along to the victims, and there are so many thousands of victims, in fact. They calculated it is much better to treat the PTSD as soon as possible at the source to avoid that it affects the people too much or later on in life, so they can reintegrate society, and this means they can go back to job and they can contribute to the economy. So it's a very complex situation, but some work starts to be done. But of course it takes time, and it needs, sorry to say so, it needs political guts to push it through. So that's from the European side. Regarding, I just want to say something. I wanted to thank here also Serge, because from the very beginning on, he was really concerned with the victims of terrorism, and this is heartwarming to see that the specialists are straight away there. Just wanted to point this out. Regarding, I mean, the integration regarding or Afghanistan, I leave this to Serge, but maybe would like to point out when we were in Raqqa, in Syria, we could see that the local people, of course, it's complex. This is the Rojava government, the Syrian Kurdish government. They try to reintegrate everyone, and I could really see with my own eyes how the Muslim people tried again to have a normal life, which was pretty good. But we also understood that, okay, Daesh has been defeated on like Raqqa or these key points, but it's still existing in small communities, and they might come back, they might rebuild, they might get another name, they might work indeed with Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, whatever, and relaunch something under a different name. So there is that risk, and there is also this complexity of what do we do with these FTFs who are on all these camps and these families. For the moment they are there, the Rojava government tries to respect as much as possible the human rights and international laws, so they don't prosecute FTFs, foreign people. They say, well, they are from your nationality, you should come and prosecute them. Of course, in the meantime, they ask or they push the other people to recognize their state. This is not the issue. But for the moment, these people are imprisoned. They are there in camps. And of course, if we don't act, then we have again the risk that this new Daesh or whatever might liberate them at a certain point. So somewhere we can manage the situation, but it's a geopolitical, very complex situation, and so nothing is really happening. And you know, like you say, it's getting prom above prom. Maybe let's just say everything should be worked out on a regional side, or it's difficult. Sorry, Serge.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, it's a pleasure, Philip. It's good to also point out that when we talk about terrorism, it's Islamist terrorism, and it's not Islam. It's not about the religion. It's a perverted ideology of this, and many other religions also creating violence around the world. We spoke about the global impact, but when we talk about like the five main terrorist groups, we need to talk about global organizations also. And when you get crushed into Syria and Iraq, then as a military commander, I would say from Daesh or ISIL, you have then you need to look at the resources that are still there, the troops, the capabilities that you still have, and then you can ask yourself the question from a strategic point of view, operational point of view, how am I going to use these troops in the future? And then automatically these groups that are very opportunistic, because when I showed you the slide with all the evolution of terrorism, they look at windows of opportunities and fertile soils for their ideology, but also for their actions to thrive. So they just look at, I would say, a map of the world, identify those parts of those regions in which there are low levels of governance and already maybe conflict going on which they can just, I would say, encrust themselves, phagocytate what is already there. So this is really a military decision by the Daesh leadership and Daesh commanders. And again, and this is why I think it's disturbing to see those figures for Afghanistan. You see that maybe a new window of opportunity is created there. There is still lack of governance. The state of Afghanistan is still not strong enough to take care of its own security. But at the same time, the international community is still there to monitor, to train, but is pulling out of the conflict zone that is called Afghanistan. And it's always a difficult time it's always very difficult to find a time in which stabilization is strong enough, a country is strong enough for you to pull out your intervention or your troops. But we have seen, of course, now a new window of opportunity for the Taliban there to really intervene and starting to strike, I would say, state structure with the military, with the police, and attacks against the state. And this leads me to maybe a final comment on your question. And those groups are fighting each other, so they are not. They really fight hard to be the world baddest organization or strongest terrorist organization in the world. Is to also see the. I would say really this opportunist approach, and also the morphing nature of a group like the Taliban, Daesh or Al-Qaeda, where depending on the external pressure that is put on them, they will shift from being a terrorist group on one day because they have limited resources, or you can be insurgents, or they can lead an insurgency on the other day. They can do both at the same time in different locations of the world. So we see a lot of adaptability and really flexibility in those organizations, making sure that they still can continue to target us on a global scale and creating mayhem where there is lack of governance and lack of capabilities and resources to also fight them. So from a military point of view, it's really easy to understand. It's like you concentrate your stronger assets in the vulnerability of the opponents. So another question.
Good morning. Thank you all for your intervention. My name is Nadia Chahia. I am a social entrepreneur at Sunium. We solve governance problems, complex issues through systems thinking. And so thank you very much, Ms. Stricker, regarding the multi-stakeholder comments that you made. I think that's extremely important in what we're trying to do, not only for our organization, but in the manner in which we need to do future governance. But this also leads to my question. In some form or manner, each of you spoke about narratives or strategic narratives, or addressing stories that need to be told. And this is where my question is that the population addressing when we're talking about terrorism, how there's so many messages out there, how can we unify them? So for my question to those who are European-based, when we talk for things about solidarity, do you feel that that's part of a narrative that needs to be part of the European identity and has to be communicated as part of the European identity to combat terrorism? And then for our overseas colleague, if it's then the responsibility of the community that deals with terrorism, all these stakeholders, government, civil society, academics, is it their responsibility to create that identity, to create a narrative, and how would you approach the relationship between each other? Thank you very much.
So maybe we can go to you first overseas, or do you want to recover for your jet lag first, and then to Niklas afterwards, if this is okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. In terms of responsibility for crafting a narrative, and I think it's a really interesting question from the European perspective, but from, I can speak from the American perspective. It's very hard for us right now to craft a strategic or counter narrative when we're living in a political environment that is, not reinforcing what we would consider traditional American values of tolerance and unity and everyone belongs. And so we're struggling there. So to say that it's government's responsibility right now, I mean, I think we want government as far away from creating a narrative in the United States as possible. So, yeah, and so in terms of what I was talking about was that narratives resonate when people think that they make sense based on their own lives. So it doesn't matter what a government says if its actions are counter to what it's saying. So I think that where the responsibility lies is for government to enact policies from a top-down approach that are actually resonating as inclusive and tolerant for their communities. Not just saying they're doing that, but actually doing that so that people experience that. I think the responsibility for individuals and for families and for communities is, if they have grievances, to not act violently about those grievances and to, I don't know that there's a responsibility there to really create narratives. I will say one last thing with respect to civil society and with respect to tech companies and with respect to private companies. There's been a lot of emphasis on their responsibility. When we're talking strictly about tech, I believe strongly that, as Mary Shelley cautioned us in the mid-19th century with Frankenstein, you're responsible for the science and technology that you create. And if the experiment has left the lab, that is your responsibility to try to fix that. And, hiding behind free speech and free markets is really, naive at best and disingenuous at worst. But what troubles me about a lot of this emphasis on countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism, which is a whole other conversation that we certainly don't have time to get into today, is that puts the onus on community often to fix the problem. And they're trying to fix problems that governments often create with their geopolitical strategies. And, so again, that's a really large question, and certainly its own 2 hours could be dedicated to that, which we don't have. But I will say I think it's really unfair to keep pushing it back on civil society. I'll stop there.
Thanks for the question, and I think it's a good topic to discuss. I mean, what role does European solidarity then also playing at the level of narratives? And I think European solidarity should be part of at least a response narrative to terrorism incidents. And why I believe that? Well, the reason is that I think, importantly, it shows that when a country is attacked here, that country and its citizens are not alone in dealing with this problem, which is transnational in nature, and which many of them had kind of no awareness of, or no kind of personal necessarily attachment to. And we've seen that, I mean, when people don't believe that, I mean, it creates frustration as well. And I saw a poll earlier this year that showed that many people in France feel that Europe is not doing enough for their kind of own personal security. And part of that reason was that they felt that Europe has not kind of stepped up enough to help France deal with its own kind of domestic terror situation, because that, of course, is the security concern that concerns them most directly. So I think in the best case scenario, having this narrative of solidarity when there is a response, it could help people feel a bit more at ease with the situation, help them feel a bit more comforted, and definitely not alone, which is important. But then when it comes to kind of unifying different sort of national narratives, I don't know how that could work, or if that would even be possible, because I mean different countries, of course, I mean have their own they have their own national communities, national concerns, national problems. So by inevitably, I mean the different national narratives will at some level be different, because I mean they will focus on the different national concerns. I mean, but to the extent possible, I mean, and why not? And then that can also then lead to more common policies as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think we will close the Q&A with those very interesting questions. This is the last time I'm taking the mic, so I would like to reiterate my thanks to you, Mrs. Manescu, for having the Institute for Economics and Peace every time at the European Parliament, and also to my colleagues in the panel for their extremely valuable interventions and the very to-the-point answers to the questions. So I would like to introduce Mr. Lorenzo Arca. He is a young professional that started an NGO called Mensana and gathering experience, but doing a very good job in trying to suppress PTSD for a lot of people around the world. So Lorenzo, this is your moment de gloire. And you just, I give you 3 to 4 minutes, otherwise you would have an overdose of glory.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Very honored to be able to speak here. Okay, my window is a little shorter than expected, so I'll rush through it. It's a very complex issue. I'm very happy that Mr. Van Steenkist is here. It was a wonderful intervention, and I hope this speaks to you and to the room, of course. Now, who are we, first of all? So we often forget that mental health can be just as important as physical health. Our NGO, our nonprofit, aims at making mental health a priority. We focus on refugees, and we focus mostly on PTSD. But we are now expanding also into emergency relief, into natural disasters, and also terrorism, in terms of the victims, of course. So we're into neuropsychology. I choose this slide because it's very important. We're concentrating on PTSD. We train instead of treat. So we empower the local population with a tool that can help them prevent and counter PTSD, which is a very cumbersome syndrome. And our last one, evaluation, is really one of our values. It's scientific proof of impact. So every treatee will go through scientific evaluation. Now I'm going to rush through a lot of slides. So as I said, so our pilot project aims at training refugees in scientifically tested methods to prevent and treat PTSD within the refugee community. But of course now we're also expanding into emergency relief, which would make local population and staff so that they can treat locally. So this is our motto, make mental health a priority. I've said that already a few times. I'm not going to explain what PTSD is. I'm sorry, I really don't have the time. If you have any more questions about it, I'm very happy to answer them after. So we have a very, I'm just going to rush through this as well. We have a very strict evaluation process in which, as I said, every treatee will go through an evaluation process because we want to make sure that we have a real impact. So I'm just going to rush through this, I'm sorry. So my project partner, Jörg Idrin, I always start my presentations by saying that a professor and an ex-student of his meet at a gym. For some, this might be the start of a great joke, but actually it's the start of a great humanitarian venture for us. And it's actually true. I did pitch him 3 years ago, the idea at a gym. And Jörg Idrin is an incredible man, very talented. He'd kill me if I said this in front of you because he's a very humble man. But I'm very lucky to have him on board, and he's an expert on PTSD and has developed a neuroscientific method that we use to prevent and counter PTSD. Our current mission is in refugees, as I've said previously. We've learned that it's a very complicated world with supranational and local governments. And we hope to, in 2019, start of 2019, be active in a UNHCR camp, Mahama. That number should be different. It's 72,000 now, but it hasn't been confirmed by the UNHCR yet. Now, coming back to, of course, to terrorism, it's also important to know that this is not only about giving them psychological health, it's also about giving them the opportunity to a second life. And bringing this back to this committee, it could, initially, we could see it as a way to make them step away from radicalization in the end. Now, we also have emergency relief missions planned. So first of all, in California, in January, where the terrible wildfires have impacted an enormous amount of people. So we're going to focus on the Camp Fire and the Ventura Fires. Camp Fires is north of San Francisco. Ventura Fires is Malibu, Los Angeles, and so on. Now, to the topic at hand, there's one missing, sorry. We're also going to be focusing on natural disasters. So in Indonesia, in the Sigi Sulawesi Community Home that's currently being built by Public Advice International Foundation, they're in need of psychological structure. It's important as well to know there, bringing it back to the community. So first of all, my project partner, I forgot to mention that, has already done several missions in natural disaster zones, such as Haiti and Japan. And in this case, what is interesting to say is that we have had reports that are making our decision process a bit slower because there are talks and local reports of a lot of terrorism cells that could impact our security there. Now to topic at hand, of course, terrorism and terrorism survivors. About 2 weeks ago, I met Dave Fortier. He's the founder and CEO of One World Strong. It's an NGO. He's a Boston Marathon survivor, and he created an NGO that aims at creating a global community of terrorism survivors. I'm sure it will be very interesting for Mr. Van Steenkist to meet with him. Now, I've talked with him. It's, of course, initial talks, but they were very positive, and I'm sure that we can, because they're all about social and community support, and we can add that psychological element. Now, I'm just going to I'm going to finish soon. So I'm going to finish on this. First of all, Mr. Van Steenkist, to thank you for your intervention, because it is very true that they have to rebuild themselves, and we have to give them that opportunity. And that's also what we want to do. And it's important to note that it's not only in a terrorist attack, it's not only the blast, the heat, or the shrapnel, or the bullet itself that can hurt the person, but it's aftermath. And that's very important to understand. And you have pointed to that exactly. And also, you added very correctly that it also impacts friends, family, and couples. Just imagine your loved one, love fading from your loved one's eyes because you're not understood. So we hope to, because we realize that help in migration crisis and in terrorism doesn't have to go, we don't have to go very far to find people that need this help. And we hope to therefore also be active in Europe on not only in the refugee community, but also in terrorism and their survivors, to give them a better future. Thank you very much for letting me speak. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And it's very motivating to see young people like you and Nadia before that are very active as a social entrepreneur or creating new NGOs, try to make a difference. And you are absolutely right. And this is something that I realized for working with the victims for, unfortunately that it happened, but I'm really glad that I was able to do it for the last 3 years. And I would say the deepest cut is not the physical one, but the psychological one. And the only problem is that people around you cannot see your scar, your psychological scar. It's more easy when it's a physical one, but the most important one is the psychological one. Thank you very much for that. So now, Mrs. Manescu, as the maître de cérémonie, I think we are all very keen to listen to your final comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you all for accepting the invitation, for coming here and participating so actively in the debate. Thank you, Serge Strobans, for bringing every year, now it's for the third year, the global index. I do hope that we will continue this tradition already, and you will keep us informed, and we will have such debates every time. I might say that it is indeed sadly to see that the terrorism still remains the great threat to security, both for Europe but also for the entire world. Even though we saw a positive trend, a decrease in the attacks, but still we do have to handle this complex issue, as you all said. It's a complex issue, and we didn't solve not even a part of it. having in mind that we need to handle it for many years already, for many years from now, not only because of the direct effects, but mainly for the side effects that we can see it not only on the side of terrorists and rehabilitation, but also and mainly the victims. And of course, the societies as a whole, that they suffered and they struggle to come back to normal, to a different normal, because we need to adjust legislation. As Niklas very well said, we are trying to adjust legislation where it's needed. And we do have some tools already. We do have United Nations, you mentioned it. United Nations is already very much focused on human rights aspects of the issue, but of course we need to be very careful. Human rights with not forgetting about the victims, because it's very easy to talk about human rights of the terrorists and the families and all that's behind of it, but to forget, very easy to forget the victims. So we do need to keep a balance. We do have on the other side European Union, which is more political body, and indeed from this perspective more effective in bringing measures and actions and implementing regulations which are making possible even the decrease of terrorism, at least in Europe. So, because in this moment in the world we have United States, which managed to regulate very well, and European Union. So those bodies are mainly the only bodies that they regulated indeed the terrorism, and they had the results on this, doing this. So we need to keep this balance. We need to keep all the stakeholders together. Not to forget the political side, to bring them on board. The political side is responsible to its citizens, and they need to bring concrete measures. So it's good to have all the stakeholders at the tables and to engage political stakeholders always with the civil society, media, academics. So we do need to have them on board. Otherwise, we will just have good gatherings with good debates and no measures in place. So we need to be very realistic and very pragmatic from this perspective. And that's why I really want to thank you once again for all of you accepting to come here in the European Parliament, because we do need your input and your vision on these matters, which are really important for the future of all of us, not only for Europe, for the entire world. One thing that I wanted to mention very quickly, a part of the many measures that the European Union already put in place, we do have the last one that entered in place this July. It's the Anti-Money Laundering and Terrorism Directive. We do have it on place, and unfortunately we just realize now, quite late, I might say, because the damage was already created, how many even member states from European Union were involved in this kind of money laundering and terrorism, connected with the terrorism actions. So showing the role of the investigations on ING, it started with BNP Paribas, ING, Danske Bank, Deutsche Bank. So all in investigations discussing and connecting money laundering with the terrorists. So we can finally say that maybe that's supposed to be probably the first measure that we should have taken, not the last measures, but still we have it in place. And I do hope that from now on we can deal with this one also much better than we did it before. And I will end with this, and I do hope that next year we will see some more results, also in terms of side effects and more actions to be taken, even at the European level, for the victims. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.